In the winter of 2003, when I was 23, I decided to take a solo camping trip into the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota. It was a reckless decision, though I didn't see it that way at the time. I'd been dealing with a rough patch in life. College was overwhelming, and personal issues were piling up. I needed to clear my head, and the woods always seemed like the perfect place for that. I'd been hiking and camping alone for years, especially in the winter, and I thought I was experienced enough to handle anything. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't check in with a ranger station, and didn't get any kind of backcountry permit. I just wanted to get away from everything and didn't consider the risks. That Friday, I parked my car on the side of a desolate road near Glacier National Forest. The sky was a bright, icy blue, and the air was crisp. I strapped on my snowshoes, threw my pack on my back, and began the 3-mile hike to a spot I'd visited once before with an ex-girlfriend. It was a little clearing near a frozen lake, surrounded by thick evergreens. The snow was deep, at least 4 feet in some places, but the snowshoes made it manageable. The hike in was peaceful. The forest was completely silent except for the occasional creak of tree branches under the weight of snow. When I arrived at the clearing, it was just as beautiful as I remembered. The lake was frozen solid, and the ice had this incredible blue hue that almost didn't seem real. I found a sheltered spot under a cluster of pines where the snow was thinner, cleared a small area, and set up camp. I spent Friday night and all of Saturday enjoying the solitude. I built a small fire, cooked simple meals, and read a book I'd brought along. A massive woodpecker drummed on a nearby tree, and a porcupine waddled by at one point. I even had some time to take a few photos with an old film camera I always carried. It was exactly what I'd hoped for: calm, quiet, and restorative. By Sunday morning, the weather had shifted. It had warmed up on Saturday, which I didn't think much of at the time, but now it was downright mild for late February. The temperature must have climbed by at least 20 degrees. The sun was out, and the snow was starting to melt. I figured it was time to pack up and head back to my car before the conditions got worse. I had a decent breakfast, packed up my gear, strapped on my snowshoes, and set off. The first part of the hike was uneventful. The snow was wet and heavier than before, but I didn't think it would be a problem. That changed quickly. As I moved uphill, the snow started clumping on my snowshoes, forming heavy, wet masses that made walking exhausting. I tried knocking the snow off with my trekking poles, but it would just build up again within a few steps. Each shoe felt like it weighed 50 pounds. After a few minutes of this, I realized I wasn't making any progress. I decided to take the snowshoes off and hike without them, thinking it would be easier. That was a huge mistake. The moment I stepped off the packed trail without the snowshoes, I sank chest deep into the snow. It was dense, compacted, and impossible to move through. Every step felt like trying to crawl out of quicksand. Panic started to set in as I realized how far I still had to go. My car was over 2 miles away, and the trail was uphill the entire way. I tried every method I could think of to make progress. I grabbed onto tree branches and brush, pulling myself forward inch by inch. I tried lying on top of the snow and rolling, but I would just sink again after a few feet. I even attempted to use my snowshoes as makeshift shovels to clear a path, but the effort was exhausting. Dropping my pack to lighten the load crossed my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. My pack held all my food, water, and gear, everything I'd need if I had to spend another night out there. As I struggled, my clothes became soaked with sweat. The wet fabric clung to my skin, and I started to worry about hypothermia. The idea of being trapped in the woods, wet and freezing, was terrifying. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but the fear was creeping in. What if I couldn't make it out? What if I got injured? What if the weather turned and it started to rain or snow again? For the next 6 hours, I fought my way through the snow. My arms burned from pulling myself along with branches, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I would stop to rest, lying flat on the snow, staring up at the gray sky, trying to muster the energy to keep going. My pace was agonizingly slow. Times I doubted I'd make it. I started eating snow to stay hydrated, even though I knew it wasn't a great idea. My hands were raw from clawing at the icy surface, and my entire body ached. Somehow I kept going. I can't explain where the strength came from. Maybe it was sheer adrenaline, or maybe it was just stubbornness. I refused to let myself stop, even when every part of me wanted to give up. As the sun began to set, I finally spotted the road through the trees. The sight of my car parked on the shoulder was almost surreal. It didn't feel real until I was standing next to it. I stripped off my wet clothes right there on the side of the road, not caring if anyone drove by. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull on the dry socks and sneakers I kept in the trunk. I climbed into the car, cranked the heater, and sat there for a long time, just letting the warmth seep into my bones. When I finally felt steady enough, I drove to the nearest town, found a small diner, and ordered a bowl of soup. The hot food felt like a miracle. I checked into a cheap motel, took a long, hot bath, and fell into bed, completely drained. The next morning, I drove home. My entire body was sore for days, and I couldn't stop replaying the experience in my mind. I realized how close I'd come to real danger. If I'd been injured, or if the weather had turned worse, I might not have made it out. The wilderness doesn't care how experienced or prepared you think you are. It doesn't care about your plans or your ego. That trip changed the way I approach the outdoors. I've gone camping and hiking many times since then, but never again in the winter, and never without telling someone where I'm going. These days, I stick to easier trips and always carry a GPS device with an SOS function. I've traded snow-covered trails for camping closer to roads, where help is never too far away. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. The woods are beautiful, but they're also unpredictable and unforgiving. I'm grateful I made it out that day, but I'll never forget the fear of being trapped in that endless, suffocating snow. It's a reminder I carry with me every time I step into the wilderness. My best friend, Mia, and I had planned a cross-country road trip for what felt like forever. It was 2012, and we were both in our early 20s, looking for adventure before settling into the monotony of adulthood. We'd saved up for months, mapped out routes, and decided we'd camp most nights to save money. It was supposed to be fun, freeing, and maybe a little daring. But somewhere along the Colorado-New Mexico border, that daring part turned into something I'd rather forget. We'd been on the road for about 6 weeks at that point. By then, we were used to roughing it. Quick dinners cooked on a small camping stove, finding secluded spots to pitch the tent, and always keeping an eye out for trouble. But nothing had prepared us for that night. We'd driven for hours through winding mountain roads, the kind that are breathtaking during the day but unnervingly desolate at night. We found a clearing just off a dirt road, surrounded by trees. It seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, no signs of other campers for miles. The sun was setting as we set up the tent, a small 2-person dome that we could assemble in our sleep by then. We ate sandwiches, talked about the next leg of our trip, and crawled into our sleeping bags just as the last light faded. First, I slept soundly. The rhythmic hum of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl was soothing. But sometime around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of an engine. It wasn't just a car driving by. The sound was close and growing louder. I sat up, my heart racing, as headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the tent in sharp flashes. The car parked maybe 50 feet away, its engine revving loudly before cutting off. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the voices. 2 men, laughing loudly. their words slurred and punctuated by the hiss and crack of beer cans being opened. Mia stirred next to me, and I could tell by her breathing that she was awake too. We didn't say anything, but we didn't have to. The fear was mutual, heavy in the air. The men weren't just passing through, they were staying. They talked loudly, their laughter echoing through the trees. I could hear the clink of bottles and the crunch of gravel under their boots as they moved around. At first, they seemed to ignore us, but then one of them said something about a car. "It's a girl's car," one of them said. My stomach dropped. Our car was parked just a few feet from the tent, visible in the moonlight. The footsteps grew closer, and soon they were beside it. I could hear them talking about it, commenting on the small size, the color, and how it was definitely a chick car. My hands gripped the edge of my sleeping bag, my mind racing. Then came the worst part. The footsteps shifted, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. Gravel crunched softly under their boots. They weren't saying anything now, just walking, pausing, then walking again. I could feel Mia tense beside me. I pressed my back against hers, both of us sitting upright now. She had a small camping knife in her hand. I clutched the can of mace I always kept in my bag. The minutes stretched endlessly. They circled the tent twice, maybe 3 times, before retreating. I heard the rustle of their cooler being opened, the clink of more bottles, and the low murmur of their voices. They weren't leaving, but at least they weren't right outside anymore. I leaned toward Mia and whispered that we needed to leave. She nodded, and without a word, we moved into action. We didn't even bother packing properly. We unzipped the tent just enough to collapse it, stuffing the entire thing, poles and all, into the trunk of the car along with our sleeping bags. Every sound felt deafening, the rustle of nylon, the slam of the trunk. But the men didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. As soon as we were in the car, I started the engine, my hands trembling so badly I almost fumbled the key. The headlights caught one of the men as he turned to look at us. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I slammed on the gas, kicking up dirt and gravel as we sped down the road. We drove for hours, too shaken to stop. The dark road seemed endless, and every set of headlights in the distance made my heart race. We finally pulled into a truck stop just as the sky was beginning to lighten. We parked under a bright light near the entrance, locked the doors, and tried to sleep, but it was restless and filled with anxious starts. That night stayed with me for a long time. Even now, years later, the memory of those footsteps circling the tent makes my skin crawl. I've camped dozens of times since, but I'm always more cautious. Never camping too far from others, always keeping an escape plan in mind. As if that wasn't enough, there was another time a couple of years later when I was camping near the Grand Canyon with a different friend. It was a beautiful spot, quiet and surrounded by trees, much like the one from before. We'd gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of hiking, but sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of screaming. It wasn't just any scream. It sounded like a woman, hysterical and crying, her voice echoing through the forest. My heart pounded as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was dark. I couldn't see anything, but the screaming continued. I wanted to help, but fear rooted me in place. What if it was a trap? What if someone was trying to lure us out? I called out softly, asking if anyone needed help, but the screaming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, but nothing happened. Eventually, I lay back down, though I didn't sleep much. The next morning, there was no sign of anyone. No tracks, no evidence that someone had been nearby. My friend brushed it off as an animal, maybe a fox or a cougar, but I wasn't so sure. The sound had been so human, so full of anguish, that I couldn't shake it. Both experiences taught me something important about camping. The wilderness is unpredictable. and people can be just as frightening as any wild animal. Even now, I'm cautious, always listening, always watching. And every so often, when I'm lying in my tent, I can't help but think about those footsteps in the night or that scream echoing through the trees. It reminds me that sometimes the scariest part of being out there isn't the unknown. It's what you can't see coming. I'll never forget the camping trip that changed how I view the wilderness forever. It happened a couple of years ago, during a group trip to Glacier National Park. I was 27, and me and a few close friends had planned this outing for months. The idea was to disconnect from our busy lives and enjoy the beauty of nature. We were all experienced hikers, so we decided to venture deep into the park. On the third day of our trip, we decided to hike into a remote part of the park, far from the tourist trails. Our goal was a secluded area in the Two Medicine Valley. It was about 7 miles from the nearest road, a spot that promised untouched beauty. We packed up early that morning and set out, the excitement of solitude pushing us through the rising heat of the day. The first part of the hike was uneventful. We walked through dense forest, the tall trees creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft glow. Occasionally, the trail opened up to reveal sweeping views of the valley below. It was breathtaking. By midday, we reached a meadow where we stopped to rest and eat. The meadow stretched wide, with patches of wildflowers and tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. In the distance, we could see the rocky ridges of the mountains that surrounded the valley. It was peaceful. After lunch, we continued on, but somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Our group had been walking in a loose line, with some of us stopping now and then to take photos or look at plants. I was towards the back of the group, and at some point, I must have taken a wrong turn or lingered too long. When I looked up again, I didn't see anyone. At first, I wasn't worried. I figured I'd just fallen a little behind. I kept walking, expecting to catch up with them around the next bend. But after about 20 minutes of walking, I realized something was off. The trail I was on didn't look familiar anymore, and there were no fresh footprints. I stopped and called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. Panic started to creep in. I didn't have the map with me. One of my friends had it. I also didn't have a compass, just a small day pack with some snacks, water, and a lightweight jacket. I was utterly alone. I took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. If I kept walking, I might get farther from my group, so I decided to climb to higher ground to get a better view of the valley. From there, I thought I could spot the others, or at least figure out where I was. The climb was harder than I expected. The hill was steep, and the loose rocks made it difficult to find footing. My heart pounded from the exertion, but I kept going. When I finally reached the top, I was breathless. From the vantage point, I scanned the valley. The expanse of green and gold stretched endlessly in every direction. The trees looked like tiny patches scattered across the land. I turned in circles, hoping to catch a glimpse of movement or hear a voice. But there was nothing. Then I saw them. 2 bison about 30 yards away, standing still in the grass. At first, I was relieved to see something alive. But that relief quickly turned to unease when I realized they weren't moving. They were just standing there, staring at me. I'd read about bison before. I knew they could be unpredictable and dangerous, especially if they felt threatened. I tried to stay calm, avoiding sudden movements. But the moment I started to take a step back, the larger of the 2 snorted loudly, and both animals began to charge. I froze for a split second, my brain struggling to process what was happening. Then instinct took over and I ran. The hill I had just climbed now became a downhill sprint. My legs moved faster than they ever had, but the uneven ground made every step treacherous. I could hear the pounding of hooves behind me, a deep, rhythmic thud that seemed to grow louder with every second. I didn't dare look back. I reached the bottom of the hill, my mind racing for options. Ahead of me was a narrow stream flanked by fallen trees. I pushed myself towards it, the cold water soaking my boots as I splashed across. My foot slipped on a rock, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before falling. I clambered onto one of the large fallen trees on the other side, the bark rough against my palms. Turning around, I finally dared to look. The bison had stopped at the edge of the stream. They stood there watching me again, their massive heads lowered slightly. I could see the dark, wet fur around their shoulders, their breaths visible in the cool air. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, they turned and continued walking down the stream, their huge bodies moving with surprising grace. I stayed perched on the log for a long time, too shaken to move. My heart was still racing, and my hands trembled as I gripped the bark beneath me. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and keep moving. My legs felt weak, but I knew I had to find my friends. I followed the stream, reasoning that it might lead me back to a familiar area. After what felt like hours, I finally heard voices in the distance. Relief washed over me as I stumbled towards the sound. My friends were gathered near a clearing, their faces lighting up when they saw me. I didn't tell them everything right away. I just said I got turned around and left it at that. It wasn't until later, when we were back at the campsite, that I shared what had happened. Even now, I can't fully explain the terror I felt during those moments alone in the valley. It wasn't just the bison, though that was terrifying enough. It was the sheer isolation, the realization that out there, in the wild, I was utterly vulnerable. That trip taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Nature is beautiful, but it doesn't care about you. It was supposed to be a normal camping trip. Just me and Sergeant Miles, my old buddy from the Army, out in the woods for a weekend getaway. Nothing fancy, just a couple of tents, a campfire, and a lot of beer. We were both in our early 30s, but the years of working together in the harshest conditions hadn't worn us down. If anything, they made us tougher. That's why I never thought much about the warnings I heard about this part of the forest. It wasn't like we hadn't been to sketchier places before. Places where people said things like, "Oh, don't go there after dark." But here we were. We decided to go off the beaten path this time. The usual camping spots felt too tame. We grabbed our gear and trekked deeper into the woods. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with thick bushes and creeping vines. The further we went, the quieter it got. The normal hum of forest life, the rustling of animals, the chirping of birds, seemed to vanish as we pressed on. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to the remoteness of the area. Maybe this part of the forest was just undisturbed. After a couple of hours of walking, we found a small clearing. It wasn't anything spectacular, but it looked safe enough. The trees were dense around us, but the spot itself was clear. We set up camp, splitting up the chores. Miles took care of the firewood while I got the tents set up. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. That night, we sat by the fire, drinking beers and talking about old times. The flames flickered in the chilly air, casting an eerie glow around the camp. It wasn't until later that night when I felt it. Something was off. At first, I couldn't pinpoint it. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, but you can't see anything. The firelight danced across the trees, but there was something wrong about the way the shadows moved. I glanced over at Miles, but he didn't seem to notice. He was busy poking at the fire, his face illuminated in the orange glow. The sounds of the forest had faded too. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was the isolation getting to my head. But as the hours passed, that feeling grew. Then came the first noise. A crack, like a branch breaking, not far from our camp. I froze, listening. My heart rate spiked as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Miles didn't even flinch. I shifted uncomfortably on my seat by the fire, staring into the darkness beyond the light. Another crack, this time closer. My hand instinctively went to the hunting knife at my side. The crack was followed by a shuffling sound, like something heavy was dragging itself through the underbrush. "Miles," I whispered, but he didn't hear me. He was too focused on the fire. The shuffling stopped. Dead silence. My eyes darted from the fire to the woods, searching the darkness for anything, but all I saw were shadows. For a moment, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again. This time a low grunt, just outside the reach of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight, shined it into the trees, and froze. There was something there. At the edge of the light, a figure. It wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, and covered in matted fur or some kind of dark cloak. I could barely make out its features, but I could see its eyes shining, reflecting the light like a predator in the night. I didn't move, couldn't. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly retreated back into the shadows. Miles was still oblivious, lost in his thoughts. I had to make a decision fast. I wasn't sure what that thing was, but I wasn't taking any chances. I stood up slowly, moving towards the fire to wake Miles. But as soon as I took a step, a high-pitched screech split the air. It sounded almost human, but wrong. It was like a wild animal, yet there was something too deliberate about it. Miles snapped to attention, standing up immediately, his hand going to his sidearm. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, looking around in confusion. I was already moving toward the trees, my heart pounding. The creature, or whatever it was, hadn't made another move, but I knew it was still out there. We both stood in silence, listening. Then, from the darkness, came a low, rumbling growl. This time, it wasn't just one noise. It was a chorus of growls, echoing from all around us. My mind raced. We needed to get out of here. I grabbed my backpack and threw it over my shoulder. "We need to leave. Now." Miles didn't argue. He grabbed his rifle and turned toward the direction we had come from. We had to make it back to the trail. But as we started walking, the growling grew louder, closer. And that's when I realized the growls weren't coming from one thing. There were multiple. I counted at least 4 distinct sounds. We were surrounded. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw them. Shadows moving in the trees, just out of sight. They were fast, too fast. Whatever they were, they weren't human. They had long, lanky limbs, and I saw their eyes flash briefly in the darkness, glowing yellow. We picked up the pace, but they followed us. At first, it was just in the distance, but as we neared the trail, the growls grew more frantic, as if they were closing in on us. My breathing became labored, my legs burning, but I kept going, not daring to look behind. And then, in an instant, everything went wrong. Miles stumbled, his foot catching on something hidden in the underbrush. He went down hard, dropping his rifle. I rushed to help him, but as I reached for his arm, something grabbed me from behind. Cold, wet fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling me backward. I spun around, my flashlight beam catching the thing holding me. It was tall, but its features were blurred by the darkness. It had long, twisted arms that stretched unnaturally, its face hidden in shadow. But its grip, it was strong, far too strong. I tried to break free, but it dragged me away from Miles. I heard him shouting, but the creature's grip tightened, and everything else faded as I was pulled deeper into the forest. I fought, kicking and thrashing, but the creature was relentless. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the creature let go. I fell to the ground, panting, my mind reeling. The growls had stopped. Everything was silent again. I scrambled to my feet and looked around. No sign of the creature, no sign of Miles. Miles? I shouted, but my voice cracked in the emptiness. There was nothing, no answer. I stood there in the silence, my heart racing. I knew I had to go back, but the thought of returning to the darkness of the woods with those things lurking around was terrifying. But I couldn't just leave him. I turned around and made my way back toward the camp, but I didn't make it far before I heard the rustling again. Closer this time, and then I saw it. A figure, tall, lean, with glowing yellow eyes. It wasn't just one anymore. There were at least 3 of them, stalking me from the trees. I wasn't going to make it, not alone. But then, just as quickly as they appeared, the figures retreated into the shadows, leaving me standing there, breathless, heart hammering in my chest. I never saw Miles again. I never found him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken him had been watching me the whole time. I made it back to the nearest town, but I'll never forget what happened out there. And every time I step into the woods, I feel like I'm being watched, like they're still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be an easy shift. Just me, the open trail, and the quiet hum of nature. I'd been working the night shifts at a small, isolated campground in the woods for almost a month. The place was tucked deep into the Appalachian Mountains, in a valley that rarely saw any visitors, especially at night. I wasn't the usual ranger. I'd taken the spot to get away from everything, get a little peace, earn a little extra cash, and avoid the madness of city life. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. But this night, things felt different. Something felt off. It had been raining all day. Not the soft, gentle drizzle you can ignore, but a steady downpour that seemed to saturate everything around me. The trees bent low with the weight of the water, their leaves flicking drops onto the ground below. I could hear the constant sound of rain, tapping against the tarp that covered the ranger booth where I worked. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. I didn't mind much. I'd gotten used to the strange lighting out here. The storm outside matched the feeling of being alone in the woods at night, distant but pressing, always hanging just behind your back. I was sitting at the desk, checking over the trail maps and making sure everything was secure for the night, when I heard the first sound of something out of place. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was a soft rustling, a low hiss, almost imperceptible under the heavier sounds. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe an animal stirring in the underbrush. The rain was heavy enough that I could barely see the dirt path through the window, but I had no reason to be worried. I'd been here for a while, and animals were part of the deal, but the hissing continued. It wasn't until I stepped outside to check the night air that I saw them. Dozens of snakes, their dark, wet bodies glistening in the dim light from the ranger booth. I had no idea how they'd gathered here, but the sight of them made my stomach churn. Some were coiled tightly together, their bodies stacked in layers as if they were feeding off each other's warmth. Others slithered around in the wet mud, their tongues flicking in and out of their mouths. The worst part was that I couldn't tell what kind they were. They were mostly too dark, too wet, their colors obscured by the night and the relentless rain. I froze for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. The hiss was louder now, mixed in with the rain and the occasional creak of the trees. The snakes seemed to be everywhere, spilling out from under rocks, weaving through the thick underbrush that lined the trail. It wasn't normal. I'd never seen anything like this in the weeks I'd been working here. It was as though the entire population of snakes had decided to converge on the campsite. I backed away from the door slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. I'd heard stories about this, about strange wildlife behavior when storms rolled in, about how animals sometimes react in ways that defy explanation. but I never thought I'd experience it firsthand. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved cautiously toward the back of the booth. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? But who would even come out in the middle of a downpour like this? I shone the light down toward the trail again, and for a second, it seemed like the snakes had grown still. There was no movement. The wet ground looked even darker now, like a black mirror reflecting the stormy sky above. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Then I heard a snap. It was a sharp, loud crack of a twig, the kind you get when something big and heavy steps on it. My heart skipped a beat as I whipped the flashlight around, my hand shaking slightly. It wasn't the snakes. They didn't make that kind of noise. And it wasn't the rain. It was something much bigger, something moving through the forest. I stepped back into the booth and locked the door behind me, my eyes wide. I'd worked the night shift for weeks now, but I had never felt like this. My nerves were shot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. I tried to get a grip, reminding myself that it was just a storm. Animals were probably just moving around, looking for shelter. But as the night wore on, that feeling of being watched only grew. The snakes were still out there, too many to count. I couldn't stop thinking about how close they were. Even though I was safe inside, the thought of them slithering around outside the booth made my skin crawl. The hours dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The rain hadn't let up at all, and I felt trapped in the booth, my flashlight the only thing between me and the dark, wet wilderness outside. The hiss of the snakes was now louder, more insistent, as if they were gathering, closing in around me. I tried to calm myself, but the tension in the air was unbearable. I kept thinking about the strange noises I'd heard earlier, the snap of the twig, the way the snakes were behaving. It didn't make sense. I spent the next few hours pacing in the booth, checking the windows every few minutes, trying to find something, anything that could explain what was happening. I kept telling myself it was just a freak occurrence, a weird storm bringing out the wildlife. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The snakes weren't acting like normal creatures. They were moving in a strange, synchronized pattern, almost as if they were waiting for something. Around 2 a.m., it happened. The lights flickered again, this time with a loud pop. The booth plunged into darkness for a second, and when the lights came back on, I saw them. The snakes weren't just outside anymore. They were inside the booth. One had slithered in through the bottom of the door, its shiny scales reflecting the dim light. It was massive, the size of a small tree branch, and it was coiled up just a few feet from where I stood. My heart raced as I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. I stepped back, but the floor was slick with water from the rain that had seeped in through the cracks. The snake didn't move, but its eyes glinted in the dim light, focused on me. I needed to leave. I knew I had to, but I couldn't bring myself to make a move. What if there were more? I knew I couldn't stay here with the snakes, but I also didn't know where to go. The entire campground was crawling with them. I grabbed the radio and tried to call for help, but the static drowned out my voice. There was no signal in the area, and I was completely alone. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. I had no choice. I had to make a run for it. I grabbed my backpack and shoved the flashlight inside, then quickly unlocked the door. I didn't know what I was going to do once I stepped outside, but I had to get away from the snakes. I pushed the door open, the rain pouring down as I stepped into the mud, my feet slipping as I sprinted toward the trailhead. I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of my flashlight, but I could hear the slithering sounds all around me, getting closer with each step. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, the cold air stinging my skin, the mud sucking at my boots. The hissing was louder now, almost like a chorus of snakes surrounding me. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from the campground as possible. The trail was slick, and I stumbled more than once, my knees scraping against the rough ground. But I kept running, pushing myself harder, faster, until my lungs burned. Then I saw it, a break in the trees, a small clearing up ahead. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like an old logging road, something I could use to get out of the valley. I kept running, making my way toward it, and when I reached the clearing, I stopped. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to catch my breath. The hissing had stopped. I was out. I'd made it. But when I turned back to look at the trail I'd just run, my blood ran cold. In the distance, I could see them, hundreds of snakes, lined up in a perfect line, their heads raised, watching me. They didn't move. They just waited. And I realized, too late, that they hadn't been following me. They had been guiding me. I turned and ran the other way, my fear taking over again. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears and the rain. The snakes, however, stayed behind, watching, waiting, and I knew without a doubt that I would never return to that campground again. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me and my husband, Jake, in the woods, far from the noise of the city, escaping the endless buzz of life. We were both in our mid-30s, and the camping trip was something we planned for months. I needed this break. Work had been overwhelming, and Jake had been working late almost every night. We didn't have much time together anymore, so I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to reconnect, breathe in the fresh air, and maybe catch up with each other in ways we hadn't in a while. We chose a secluded spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place you could only reach by a long drive and a hike through thick trees. I liked it that way. There were no distractions, no neighbors, no busy roads, no one around for miles. It felt private, safe. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the dense forest. I could smell the damp earth and pine, the air crisp with the scent of fresh rain that had passed earlier. It was perfect. Jake and I spent the next hour setting up camp. The tent, the campfire, and our backpacks filled with gear. It wasn't our first camping trip, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the quiet. We didn't even have cell service, which normally would have made me nervous. But in that moment, it felt liberating. No phone calls, no emails, just the two of us alone in nature. By the time night fell, the stars were bright and the fire crackled. We sat there in silence for a while, the flames dancing between us, casting shadows on the trees. The air grew colder as the night stretched on, and the forest grew even quieter, almost unnervingly so. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just the fire and the distant calls of owls. I hadn't noticed it before, but after a while, I realized there was something strange about the way the forest felt. It was almost as if the trees were watching us. I know that sounds silly, but it was a feeling I couldn't shake. Jake didn't seem to notice anything, so I shrugged it off, focusing instead on the warmth of the fire and the familiar sound of his voice as we talked about old times. But even then, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I didn't want to say anything to Jake, not because I thought he'd dismiss me, but because I didn't want to ruin the night. I wanted to enjoy this time together. The night dragged on, the fire dimming as we sat there, and the forest grew eerily still. We decided to go to bed early, and Jake unzipped the tent for us. The chill had settled deep into the air now, and as I crawled inside the tent, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at the surrounding trees, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the starlight. The inside of the tent was cozy, warm with the heat from our sleeping bags. Jake was already settling in, adjusting his pillow. He had fallen asleep almost immediately, but I stayed awake, staring at the tent ceiling. It was the silence. It was unsettling. I could hear every rustle of my own movements, every shift of the sleeping bag. The trees outside had become completely still. No wind, no sound, just the heavy silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, wide awake, until I finally heard it, a soft crunch of leaves outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just a wild animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then it happened again. Crunch, crunch. This time, it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone was out there walking around the tent. My heart pounded. I wanted to wake Jake, but I didn't want to scare him. I told myself it was probably nothing. A hiker passing through, maybe, or a deer wandering too close. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but everything else around us was still.
Nobody's.
No movement, just those slow, deliberate steps. I waited, not daring to move, but they didn't stop. They circled around the tent, one step after another. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached over to shake Jake awake, but he didn't stir. I shook him harder. "Jake!" I whispered urgently. "Jake, wake up." Finally, he groggily opened his eyes. "What is it?" His voice was thick with sleep. "I hear something outside," I said, my voice trembling. Jake rubbed his eyes, still half asleep. "It's probably just an animal. Relax." But I couldn't relax. My stomach twisted into knots. I could still hear those steps, moving around the tent, getting closer. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. The footsteps came closer, then stopped right by the tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was no sound, just silence. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, heavy, slow breaths, right outside our tent. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. I looked at Jake, panic in my eyes. He was staring at me now, fully awake, his expression hardening with confusion. I don't know how long we stayed like that, listening to the shallow, rasping breath just outside the tent. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, this time, retreating into the darkness. My chest was tight. My breath was shallow. I had to say something, but I didn't know what. I didn't want to say anything that would make Jake think I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I tried to stay quiet, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. What if it was someone watching us? What if it wasn't just a hiker? We both lay there, tense and silent, the sounds of the forest returning slowly, the night pressing in around us. It was a long time before either of us fell asleep. But when I finally did manage to drift off, I had no idea what time it was. I woke up with a start. It was still dark, but something was different. The air had changed. I could feel it. I could hear something, too, low and distant, like the sound of a truck engine, rumbling somewhere far away. But that didn't make sense. We were miles from the nearest road. There was no way a vehicle could be here. I looked over at Jake, who was still sound asleep, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I couldn't explain why. My instincts were on high alert. I felt like I needed to get out of the tent and move. I didn't know where, but anywhere but here. I carefully unzipped the tent, trying to make as little noise as possible. I stepped out into the cold night air, my breath visible in the stillness. The forest seemed even darker now, the shadows deeper, and the quiet was almost suffocating. I walked a little ways away from the tent, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees. There was nothing, no sign of anyone.
No footsteps.
Just the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant sound of water flowing somewhere far off. I stayed there for a few minutes, listening. Everything felt off. I couldn't explain why, but I knew something wasn't right. Just as I was about to turn back to the tent, I heard something, a sharp, fast movement to my left. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was in the woods with me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The footsteps from earlier came back to me, and I felt the same sense of dread rush through me. I quickly turned and made my way back to the tent. I didn't look back, but I could hear something moving behind me, just out of sight, always just behind me. I zipped myself back into the tent, my hands shaking. Jake stirred but didn't wake up. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the sounds around us, terrified that someone was still out there. When morning finally came, the forest was still and silent. The sun was just beginning to rise, and everything looked normal again. But my mind was still racing. We packed up and left as quickly as we could, not speaking much along the way. Jake didn't seem to think much of what happened, and I didn't know how to explain it to him. All I knew was that something was out there, something that didn't belong in those woods, and I wasn't about to stay another minute. We left the mountains and drove home, but I never forgot that feeling. The way the air changed, the footsteps that circled our tent, and the sound of breathing just outside. Whatever it was, it didn't belong there. It still haunts me to this day, the thought of someone or something watching us from the shadows of the woods. I don't know who or what it was, but I do know one thing. I'll never go camping in those mountains again. I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the roof of the truck, a rhythmic drumming that would have been soothing under normal circumstances. But I wasn't feeling normal. I'd parked in a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, just the kind of place I'd normally choose for some quiet solitude. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I became. It had started off as a solo camping trip, just me, my truck, and the woods. I needed the break. Had been working non-stop for months, and the city noise was driving me mad. The idea of fresh air, isolation, and the silence of nature was supposed to be relaxing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I checked the time on my phone. It was past midnight, and the rain wasn't letting up. The forecast hadn't predicted anything like this. The storm had rolled in quickly, and the wind had picked up so much that the trees were starting to sway in a way that made my gut twist. My headlights were barely cutting through the dark, and the dim glow from the truck's interior only added to the oppressive feeling around me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was overthinking it. The storm wasn't that bad, and I'd camped in worse weather before. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I glanced around. The area looked completely abandoned. No signs of other campers, no lights in sight, nothing but thick forest and an overwhelming stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel natural. I decided to get out of the truck, stretch my legs. The cold air hit me like a wall as I opened the door, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. The crunch of wet leaves underfoot was the only sound as I made my way to the campfire pit. I hadn't bothered to start a fire. It had been raining on and off all day, and everything was soaked. So, I settled down by the truck and sat on the tailgate, trying to block out the sounds of the storm. Minutes passed, but the feeling didn't go away. It got worse, actually. The wind howled through the trees, and I couldn't help but notice how unnatural it sounded. It wasn't the usual wind rustling the branches. It was something more intense, almost deliberate. Felt like it was circling me, getting closer, picking up speed. My instincts were on high alert, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving fast across the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then it darted again, too quick for anything natural. It was human-sized, but moving at an impossible speed. My heart started pounding in my chest as I stared into the darkness, hoping it was just a deer or some other animal. but something in my gut told me otherwise. I jumped into the truck, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. My headlights flashed across the trees, but I didn't see anything. The shadow was gone, but that didn't make me feel any better. It just made everything feel worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching me from the woods. I sat in the truck for a while, waiting for the storm to pass, but the unease didn't subside. Every sound, every crack of a branch, every gust of wind made me flinch. My eyes kept darting to the edge of the tree line, half expecting to see movement. But the woods stayed still, too still. By the time the rain slowed down, I was barely able to keep my eyes open. Exhaustion was starting to weigh on me, but I knew I couldn't sleep in the truck, not with whatever was out there. I decided to get my gear together and head into the tent. Maybe a change of scenery would help calm my nerves. I grabbed my flashlight, my pack, and my camping gear and walked through the mud toward the tent. The tent was small, just big enough for me to lie down in, but as I unzipped it and crawled inside, the feeling of being exposed overwhelmed me. The storm was still drizzling outside, the occasional rumble of thunder reverberating through the forest. The wind had died down somewhat, but the eerie quiet still hung in the air. I laid there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the rain. But it was hard to focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the shadow I had seen earlier, to the way it moved too fast, too fluid. It didn't seem like anything I'd seen before, and the idea that it might have been another person sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to imagine what could be lurking just outside my tent. So, I closed my eyes, telling myself that it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But sleep didn't come. Every noise made my heart race. The sound of rain on the canvas, the occasional groan of a tree in the wind, felt amplified in the silence of the woods. Suddenly, there was a sound outside the tent, a soft crunch of leaves, like something heavy was moving through the wet forest. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a squirrel or a raccoon. It was deliberate, slow, as if someone was walking carefully, trying not to make noise. I held my breath, straining to hear. The crunching stopped, then started again, closer this time. I gripped the flashlight tightly in my hand, my fingers slick with sweat. Every part of me screamed to stay quiet, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't just ignore it. My mind raced through all the possibilities. An animal, a lost hiker, or something worse. The footsteps grew louder. They were moving along the edge of the campsite now, just outside the circle of the tent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the blood rush to my head. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, matching the rhythm of the footsteps. They were getting closer, and then, just as quickly, they stopped. I waited in the dark, barely breathing, my hands gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I tried to steady myself, to think logically. Could just be someone else camping nearby. A ranger, a hiker, anything. But that didn't feel right. Then, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping underfoot broke the silence, and I jumped. The footsteps started again, moving around the tent, circling it. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, thudding against my ribs. I wanted to shout, to call out, but I knew better. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention to myself. I stayed perfectly still, praying whoever or whatever was out there wouldn't notice me. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Each second felt like an eternity as the footsteps continued to circle the tent, just outside my line of sight. I could hear the faint rustle of branches in the wind, but that wasn't what held my attention. It was the feeling that something was wrong. Something wasn't natural about it. The way the steps were timed, the way they moved, calm, deliberate, too controlled. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped entirely. Silence descended on the campsite, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. My breath felt too loud, the thumping of my heart too deafening. I stayed frozen, not daring to make a sound, waiting for the next movement. But there was nothing. Minutes passed. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in the dark, unable to make a decision. The fear had me paralyzed, unsure whether to stay in the tent or flee into the forest. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stay in the open, couldn't risk it. I had to make a run for it. As quietly as I could, I unzipped the tent, carefully easing out of it and into the muddy ground. The flashlight in my hand was a small comfort, but I knew it wouldn't do much to protect me. I moved swiftly and silently, heading toward the truck, each step seeming to echo louder than the last. My breath caught in my throat when I heard another crunch of leaves from behind me. It was no longer just one set of footsteps. I didn't look back, couldn't. I ran, heart pounding, the cold air biting at my skin. My feet slipped in the mud, but I didn't stop. The truck was just ahead, its headlights still on, illuminating the empty campsite. I reached it in what felt like an eternity and slammed the door behind me. The truck roared to life with a twist of the key, and I didn't look back. As I drove away, the woods faded into the rearview mirror. The storm continued to pour, the night just as dark as it had been when I first arrived. But I didn't care about the rain anymore. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as I could. When I finally made it back to the nearest town, the sun was rising and the storm had passed. But something had changed in me. I could still hear the footsteps, still feel the chill of that strange presence following me. I didn't know who or what had been in those woods, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't be going back. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some silence is too heavy, and some things are better left alone. The storm started as a faint whisper. At first, it was just the wind brushing against the thin walls of the camper, but soon it grew louder, rattling the metal legs that kept our camper off the ground. I didn't know what time it was, but the night felt like it had stretched on forever. I was about 11 then, and camping was supposed to be the big family tradition. This year, it was just my mom and me. The others had dropped out, claiming busy schedules or other excuses. Mom didn't seem to mind. She said it would be fun, just the two of us. We had set up in a campground somewhere deep in Missouri, far enough from the city to see the stars clearly at night. The camper we were staying in was an old truck bed camper. My mom had slid it off the truck and set it on its metal legs, leaving it freestanding. It wasn't huge, just big enough for a tiny kitchen, a small bed for my mom, and a cramped bunk for me. The first couple of days had been fine. We fished at the nearby lake, grilled hot dogs over a fire, and played cards when the sun went down. The air was muggy, and the mosquitoes were relentless, but it felt like camping should. That night, though, something felt different. I woke up to the sound of the wind howling through the trees. The camper shook slightly, enough to make the cheap aluminum walls creak. I rubbed my eyes and sat up in my bunk. The tiny space was dimly lit by a small battery-powered lantern my mom always left on in case I needed to get up in the night. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Her face was tight, her eyes staring at the small window by her bed. I climbed down quietly, my bare feet touching the cold floor. I didn't need to ask what was wrong. The sound outside was enough to make my stomach knot. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was a deep, guttural roar, like a train barreling through the woods. The camper trembled as the wind grew stronger. My mom didn't move, didn't say a word. She just sat there, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening for something specific. I crouched down by the window and peered out into the night. The darkness was so complete it felt like it could swallow the world whole. The roar grew louder, a relentless sound that made my ears ache. The camper rocked, the metal legs groaning under the strain. My heart was racing now, pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I looked back at my mom. She didn't look scared exactly, but there was a tension in her that made me feel like I shouldn't make a sound. And then it hit. The wind slammed into the camper with a force that made me think it might collapse. The whole structure tilted to one side, the legs on that side screeching as they scraped against the ground. My mom grabbed the edge of the bed, her knuckles white. I clung to the counter, my knees digging into the floor to keep from sliding. For a moment, I thought the camper was going to tip over. My mind raced, imagining us trapped inside, crushed under the weight of the camper as it folded in on itself. But then, just as quickly as it had tilted, it settled back down. The roar continued, but the shaking eased slightly. I stayed there, crouched on the floor, for what felt like hours. My mom didn't move from her spot, her eyes never leaving the window. The sound of the wind was deafening, but beneath it, I could hear other noises. Distant crashes, the sound of trees snapping like twigs, and somewhere far off, what might have been a scream. Eventually, the wind began to die down. The roar faded to a low growl, and then to silence. The camper was still, the only sound now the faint creaking of the metal legs as they adjusted to the shift in weight. My mom finally moved, standing slowly and peering out the window. I joined her, pressing my face to the glass. The world outside was a mess. Branches were scattered across the ground, and one of the larger campers a few spots down had been tipped onto its side. When we stepped outside, the air was heavy and still, the kind of silence that only comes after a storm. The ground was littered with debris, twigs, leaves, and chunks of bark torn from the trees. The other campers were emerging from their shelters, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Word spread quickly through the campground. The storm had been a tornado, small but powerful enough to wreak havoc. A troop of Girl Scouts camping in tents at the far end of the grounds had been hit the hardest. Their tents had been lifted off the ground and dropped back down, collapsing around them. They had spent the rest of the night huddled in the campground bathroom, a concrete building that was thankfully sturdy enough to keep them safe. The next morning, we packed up and left. The fun of camping was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. As we drove away, I looked out the window at the wreckage left behind. The trees were bent and broken, and the air still smelled of rain and dirt. It wasn't until years later that I realized how close we had come to disaster that night. The camper had been balanced on flimsy metal legs, completely vulnerable to the storm. If the tornado had been just a little closer, it would have toppled us like a toy. That was the last time my mom took us camping. She never said it outright, but I think that night shook her in a way she didn't want to admit. For me, the memory of that roaring wind and the fragile walls of the camper stayed with me. I haven't been able to sleep in a camper since. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being surrounded by trees and away from the noise of daily life that brings me peace. This happened back in the summer of 2016, when my friend Matt and I decided to take a weekend camping trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. We had heard about a trail called Devil's Ridge Loop, which was supposed to be challenging but offered amazing views. We were both in our mid-20s and thought we were in decent shape, so we packed up our gear and set out early on a Saturday morning. The trail was beautiful but tough. It started with a steady incline that made our legs burn, but every once in a while, we'd get a glimpse of the surrounding mountains through breaks in the trees, and it made the effort worth it. We planned to hike the full loop, which was around 12 miles, and then return to our campsite before sunset. By noon, we were about halfway through when Matt started complaining about a headache. At first, we thought it was just dehydration, so we took a break, drank water, and had a snack. But instead of getting better, his headache turned into a full-blown migraine. He was pale and sweating, and I could tell he needed to get back to camp and lie down. Matt pulled out a map and pointed to a shortcut that cut through the forest and would get him back to camp faster. He assured me he'd be fine and told me to finish the hike since we were already this far in. I was hesitant but eventually agreed. I watched him head off down the shortcut and then continued on the trail alone. The solitude was nice at first. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant chirping of birds. The trail started descending into a densely wooded valley, and the sunlight barely filtered through the canopy above. I was focused on my footing when I heard the first scream. It stopped me in my tracks. It was distant, but the sound was unmistakable, high-pitched, raw, and full of terror. My first thought was that someone was in trouble, maybe being attacked. I strained my ears, waiting to hear it again. A few seconds later, it came again, this time louder. I froze. In that moment, my mind was racing. Was it a person? An animal? I had heard that mountain lions sometimes sound like a woman screaming, but this was so unsettling that I couldn't be sure. The screams continued, growing louder and more frequent, and I felt my chest tighten. I knew mountain lions were native to this area, but hearing their cries in person was different than reading about them. I couldn't decide what to do. If it was a mountain lion, making noise might scare it off, or it might just attract it. If it was something else, I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Every survival tip I'd ever read seemed to contradict itself in that moment. I stood there, heart pounding, and tried to figure out which direction the sound was coming from. It was hard to tell because it echoed through the valley, but I thought it was coming from somewhere to my left. Slowly, I started moving to the right, away from the noise, keeping my steps as quiet as possible. The forest felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and every crack of a branch made me flinch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. The screams continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was almost worse. I stood there, paralyzed, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, rustling, anything at all. But the forest was completely still. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I practically sprinted down the trail, stumbling over roots and rocks but refusing to stop. When I finally made it back to camp, Matt was lying in the tent, looking miserable but alive. He asked if I'd finished the trail, and I just nodded, unable to find the words to explain what I'd heard. A few years later, in 2019, I went to a music festival with some friends. It was one of those multi-day events where people camped out in tents near the venue. The campsite was packed with people, and tents were crammed together so tightly that it felt like a maze. The first night was a blast. We stayed up late listening to live music and hanging out by the fire. By the time we crawled into our tent, it was well past midnight, and we were exhausted. My friend Sarah and I shared a small two-person tent, and we fell asleep almost immediately. At dawn, I woke up to the sound of an engine starting. It was muffled at first, and I assumed it was someone packing up and leaving early. I rolled over, trying to go back to sleep, but the sound got louder. When I opened my eyes, I saw the faint glow of red tail lights through the fabric of the tent. At first, I was confused, still half asleep, but then I realized the truck was moving, and it was heading straight for us. Panic set in. I reached over and grabbed Sarah, who was still sound asleep, and rolled her on top of me just as the truck's tires crushed the edge of our tent. The metal frame bent inward, and I felt the ground vibrate as the truck passed inches away from where Sarah had been lying. When the truck finally stopped, I scrambled out of the tent, heart racing. A group of people was yelling at the driver, who was clearly drunk and had no idea what he'd just done. The side of our tent was completely flattened, and our gear was scattered everywhere. Sarah was shaken but unharmed, and I was just grateful we had made it out alive. The driver was escorted out by security, and we spent the rest of the morning trying to salvage what we could of our campsite. Both of these experiences left me shaken in different ways. The hike reminded me how vulnerable we are in nature, where we're no longer at the top of the food chain. The festival incident, on the other hand, showed me how careless and dangerous people can be. To this day, I still go hiking and camping, but those moments are always in the back of my mind. They serve as a reminder that no matter how prepared you think you are, there's always something unpredictable waiting just around the corner. It was a late summer evening, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow on the rugged hills of the canyon. I'd found the perfect spot to set up camp, far from the usual crowded campgrounds, just a quiet, secluded area near the edge of a river. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, a peaceful retreat from the busy life I had back in town. I needed the solitude, a break from constant noise and stress. The night crept in quickly, and as the stars began to fill the sky, I made a small fire, the crackling of the wood breaking the silence around me. I could hear the rustling of the trees in the cool evening breeze and the occasional chirp of a cricket. It was peaceful, just the way I liked it. I was alone with no one for miles. I had a couple of books and a flask of coffee to keep me company, and I settled in for a night of reading and unwinding. The firelight danced on the rocks nearby, and the only thing I could see for miles was the dark outline of the canyon walls. I had no real concerns, just the quiet of nature and the comfort of being away from everything. That was until I heard the truck. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle passing by on the distant dirt road, but then the engine grew louder, and I realized it was heading down the narrow dirt path that led to the river. My heart skipped a beat. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, not this far into the canyon, not this time of night. I stood up slowly, trying to get a better view. I couldn't see the truck yet, but I could hear the tires crunching on the gravel as it came closer. I felt a slight unease, but it was probably just some campers looking for a quiet spot, right? Still, the thought gnawed at the back of my mind. I had no neighbors. No one should have been here. The truck finally came into view, a beat-up old pickup with its headlights cutting through the dark like a knife. The truck slowed as it neared my camp, the engine sputtering with a strange growl. They stopped about 50 yards away, the headlights shining directly toward my campsite. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, watching them. No one got out. There was just the hum of the engine and the harsh glare of the headlights. I didn't move, not wanting to draw attention to myself. But after what felt like an eternity, the truck reversed, turning back toward the main road. I stood there, confused. What the hell was that all about? I wasn't sure if I should pack up and leave or stay and hope they were just passing through. But then, something strange happened. The truck came back, faster this time, speeding down the road in a way that didn't seem normal. As the headlights neared, I could see the truck fishtailing slightly, like the driver was in a hurry. Panic surged in my chest. Something wasn't right. I turned to my camp, grabbing my bag and stuffing it haphazardly into the back of my car. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get the hell out of there, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just some drunk people, or maybe they needed help. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I wasn't going to sit around and find out. As I threw my things into the car, I heard the truck engine rev again, this time closer, the sound of tires skidding on loose gravel sending a chill down my spine. I slammed the trunk shut and jumped into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The truck had stopped again, but this time, I could hear movement, the faint sound of footsteps. I didn't look. I didn't want to. My foot slammed on the gas pedal, and I shot off into the night, the headlights of the truck still visible in my rearview mirror. I didn't know if I was being followed, but I didn't want to find out. I sped down the canyon road, weaving around the bends, the sound of my tires against the gravel echoing in the silence. The truck, if it was behind me, was keeping its distance, but that didn't make me feel safer. The idea that someone was following me, someone who could have been watching me, was terrifying. After what felt like an hour, I finally reached the bottom of the canyon, where the road split and led into a wider, more open area. My heart was still racing. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see the truck, but there was nothing. I kept driving for a while longer, hoping I'd lost whoever it was. Eventually, I pulled off to the side of the road, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline. I locked the car doors and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was quiet again, the only sound being the occasional rustling of the wind. That's when I saw it again. The truck was parked on the side of the road, just ahead of me, facing the opposite direction. My heart lurched into my throat, and panic set in again. Was it the same truck? Had they caught up to me? I couldn't see anyone in the truck, but the engine was still running, casting a soft glow from the headlights. I froze, unsure of what to do. The last thing I wanted was to get out of the car and risk walking right into whatever mess I had just gotten myself into. I stayed in the car, staring at the truck. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the truck's lights blinked off. The engine went quiet. For a moment, there was no sound at all. I waited. I had to know what was going on. Then, the truck's engine roared to life again, and the headlights flipped on. The vehicle sped off, disappearing around the bend. I stayed in the car for what felt like forever, too scared to leave, too scared to go back to camp. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my mind raced with confusion and fear. What had just happened? Why had they been following me? I had no answers, no explanation, only a deep sense of unease that would haunt me for the rest of the night. I stayed in that spot for hours, the night crawling on, the air thick with tension. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but the truck never returned. Eventually, I couldn't stay awake any longer. I fell asleep in the driver's seat, exhaustion finally taking over. The next morning, I drove back up to my campsite, hoping everything would be just as I left it. But when I pulled in, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The truck was there, parked nearby, and I could see a group of people milling around, talking in low voices. I stayed in my car, watching them from a distance. After a while, one of them looked up and noticed me. They waved, and I waved back, unsure of what to do. I pulled up slowly, my heart still pounding in my chest. Turns out they hadn't been following me at all. It was a group of friends who had been camping further down the beach. One of their friends had gone missing, and they thought they had seen something suspicious near my camp. They'd gotten scared, thinking the worst, that their friend had been kidnapped or something. After driving around, trying to find her, they'd realized they were chasing shadows. It was just a misunderstanding, a series of unfortunate coincidences. But that didn't make the fear I felt any less real. As I packed up to leave, my thoughts were a jumbled mess. I hadn't been robbed, but the fear of being alone in that canyon with no one around, with strange people who might have been dangerous, stuck with me. I didn't want to be paranoid, but something inside me knew that it could have turned out much worse. That night, in the silence of the canyon, I'd come face to face with just how vulnerable I really was out there. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my grandmother, and her ex-husband, Jack. It seemed like an odd combination, but I didn't mind. My grandmother, Helen, had always been independent, and Jack, well, he was a man who loved the outdoors. They'd been divorced for years, but somehow, they still got along well enough to go camping together. I had tagged along because I wanted a break from the city and figured it would be a good opportunity to reconnect with both of them. The trip started off on a quiet, chilly Friday morning in late autumn. We drove about 2 hours outside the city to a remote campground tucked away in a dense forest. The place had been quiet the last few times my grandmother had been there, a peaceful, serene spot where she liked to escape from everything. The air was crisp and clean, and as we pulled into the campground, a slight fog hung over the trees, giving everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. I could tell my grandmother was excited. She had always loved camping, and it was clear she found something soothing about being out in nature. Jack, however, seemed more serious. He kept looking around, his eyes scanning the woods as if he was expecting something to jump out at any moment. The three of us started setting up camp, with Jack taking charge of the tent and my grandmother making sure we had enough firewood. I helped where I could, but most of the time I stayed out of the way. The last thing I wanted was to mess up their routine, especially after so many years of practice. By nightfall, we had the fire going. It crackled and popped, sending sparks into the air as the chill set in. The forest around us felt alive, the wind rustling the branches and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. Despite the beauty of it all, there was something unsettling in the air. Maybe it was the isolation or the fact that we were so far removed from civilization. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just us and the vast expanse of trees that surrounded the campground. As the fire grew smaller, Jack stood up, muttering something under his breath. He started pacing, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I noticed something strange. The wind had died down completely, and the forest had gone silent. No more owls, no rustling leaves. It was as if the entire world had paused for a moment. "Everything all right?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness. Jack didn't answer at first, just kept walking around in circles. I looked at my grandmother, but she didn't seem concerned. She was busy adding more logs to the fire, as if nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "I'll go for a walk," Jack finally said. "Clear my head." Before I could respond, he was already walking toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows. My grandmother looked up briefly but didn't seem to care. She was used to Jack's odd behavior. He had always been a bit of a loner, even when they were together. I decided to stay by the fire, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. The silence around us was heavy, almost oppressive. I stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. It felt like hours before Jack finally returned, though it was probably only half an hour. He came out of the forest, looking more tense than ever. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide, darting around like he had seen something he couldn't explain. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice sharp with concern. Jack didn't answer immediately. He just stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Something's out there. I don't know what, but I saw something moving in the woods. Not an animal, something else." I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he had just gotten spooked by the isolation. "You're imagining things, Jack. It's just the woods." But Jack was insistent. "No, it wasn't. I saw something. I'm telling you, it was wrong." I didn't know how to respond. My grandmother, who had always been the calm one, seemed unfazed. She just kept tending to the fire, as if nothing unusual had happened. Jack, though, continued to stare into the forest. His eyes narrowed as if he were waiting for something to appear. It wasn't long before the tension started to build. The woods, which had felt so peaceful earlier, now felt suffocating, like they were closing in on us. The silence returned, and the air became thick, heavy with something unspoken. We decided to call it a night, though none of us slept well. I tossed and turned, listening to every creak and rustle in the trees. Every time a twig snapped or the wind howled, my heart raced. I wasn't sure if it was just the unease from Jack's story or if there was something truly wrong with the forest. But sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, we awoke to a heavy fog rolling in, swallowing up everything in sight. I could barely see the campground a few feet away, let alone the distant trees. The atmosphere felt different, thick, almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "We should pack up," I suggested, my voice unsteady. "This place feels off." But my grandmother shook her head. "Nonsense. It's just the fog. We'll be fine." Jack, on the other hand, didn't seem so sure. He was already packing his gear in a hurried, almost frantic manner. I could see his hands shaking as he folded up the tent. It wasn't like him to be so jittery. "We're leaving today, no matter what," Jack said, his voice hard. "There's something in those woods, and I'm not sticking around to find out what it is." I didn't argue. I felt the same way. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, moving in strange patterns as if it were trying to pull us deeper into the forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting something to emerge from the mist at any moment. We managed to pack up camp quickly, though it was hard to stay focused with the unsettling feeling gnawing at me. The air felt colder now, and the fog seemed to thicken by the minute. We barely said a word as we gathered our things and started walking back to the car. The forest felt too quiet, too still, as if the trees were watching us. And then we heard it, a sound from deep within the forest, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the air around us. It was unlike any animal sound I had ever heard, deep and menacing. My grandmother froze, her face going pale as she turned toward the trees. Jack, too, stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide. "We need to go. Now," he whispered urgently. We ran. The fog thickened, making it nearly impossible to see, but we didn't stop. My grandmother, surprisingly agile for her age, kept pace with us. We didn't know if whatever was making that sound was following us, but every step we took felt like we were being pursued by something unseen. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled twice, my heart pounding in my chest. The growls grew louder, closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the clearing where we had parked the car. Jack threw open the door, and we piled in without a second thought. The engine roared to life, and we sped away without looking back. As we drove away, the fog started to dissipate, and the oppressive silence lifted. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the landscape. My grandmother sat in the back seat, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say anything. Jack, still gripping the steering wheel tightly, kept his eyes on the road, but his knuckles were white. We didn't speak much during the drive back to the city, but one thing was clear. We had barely escaped whatever it was that lurked in those woods. We were lucky, and I knew that we wouldn't be coming back to this place anytime soon. Looking back now, I still don't know what we heard that day in the forest. The growl, the feeling of being watched, the thick fog. It all felt like something out of a nightmare, but it was real and I'll never forget it. There are places in this world where the normal rules don't seem to apply, where the forest isn't just trees and wildlife but something darker, something that waits for you to wander too far off the path. And once you're lost, it's not just the forest that's after you. I had been working as a cop for about 5 years now, and when I got the call about an undercover operation in a remote forest, I didn't hesitate. They needed me and a small team to investigate reports of illegal activity. Some local poachers or worse, but the details weren't clear. The plan was simple: set up camp, observe from a distance, and gather intel. It wasn't supposed to be a dangerous mission, but I knew that out here, anything could happen. The operation was set in the dense woods of northern Maine. The terrain was rough, and the nearest town was about 2 hours away. I wasn't used to these kinds of conditions. Usually, I worked in the city, on streets filled with people, cars, and sirens. But something about the woods made me uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I'd handled tough situations before. We were dropped off in the early morning, just as the sun was starting to rise. The chill in the air cut through my jacket as we hiked to our campsite. The forest seemed peaceful enough, the kind of quiet that made every snap of a twig sound too loud. We set up our small tents and got the gear ready. The mission wasn't supposed to be complicated, just waiting and watching. The first night went by uneventfully. I was on watch duty, sitting by the campfire, scanning the trees with binoculars. Nothing moved. The sky was pitch black, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a night owl. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was the kind of paranoia that creeps up when you're in the wilderness, far from anyone who could help if something went wrong. I dismissed it, though. Just nerves, I thought. The second night was when things started to get strange. I was woken up by a noise from outside the tent. Something heavy, like boots crunching through the dry leaves. I thought it was one of the other officers, but when I looked around, nobody else was moving. My heart rate picked up as I listened more closely. The sounds were too irregular, too deliberate, as if someone was trying to stay hidden but wasn't doing a very good job of it. I waited for a few moments, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the sounds continued. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and my sidearm, keeping low as I moved toward the noise. My boots crunched against the ground, and every step felt like a betrayal of my position. The beam of light from my flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the forest floor and the trees. I crept forward, the noise now getting closer. I was sweating now, my nerves stretched thin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a wild animal or another officer making noise. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. I froze. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a fellow officer. The figure was tall, and it was moving with purpose, its head slightly down and its body hunched. I couldn't tell who or what it was, but I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about it. I held my breath, not daring to move. The shadow disappeared into the trees, and I waited for what felt like hours. But in reality, it was only a few minutes. I had to make a decision. Should I follow? Should I report it? The team was supposed to be my priority, but I knew I couldn't let this slip by without investigating. I took another step forward, my heart thudding in my chest. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Team Alpha, report status, came the voice of Sergeant Hall. I almost jumped out of my skin. I tried to steady my breathing, responding quietly, "Nothing to report, Sergeant. Just checking the area." I waited for his response, but there was nothing. No reassurance, no command. I clicked the radio again, but it was dead. It had been working fine just moments ago. My stomach twisted, and I turned around, scanning the camp. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but I knew something was off. That's when I heard the rustle again, closer this time. The shadow I had seen earlier was back, but now it was more distinct, moving rapidly through the trees. It wasn't alone. There were others, several figures moving through the woods like they knew exactly where to go. I felt my pulse race, and I wasn't sure whether to run or to stay hidden. I had no backup, and the radio was useless. I couldn't rely on the rest of the team. I had to handle this on my own. I ducked behind a large rock, keeping my flashlight turned off, praying that they wouldn't spot me. The figures moved past me, but I could hear them talking in low voices, not in English, but something foreign. Their steps grew fainter, and after a few minutes, I risked a glance. The area was empty again. but I knew better than to think I was safe. I decided to follow them. The figures had gone deeper into the woods, and I had to know what they were doing out here. I knew the risk, but curiosity and duty pushed me forward. I moved as quietly as I could, using the trees as cover. My training kicked in, and I remembered to watch for signs. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, anything that might give away their location. Hours passed, and the forest grew denser. The figures had led me far from the camp. At one point, I realized I had no idea where I was anymore. The world had gone silent, the night air thick and still. The only sounds were the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. My stomach was in knots, and my mind raced with possibilities. Who were these people? What were they doing in the woods? Then I heard something, a faint cry, like a muffled scream. It wasn't human, though. It was something darker, something that made my blood run cold. I froze, trying to locate the sound. It was coming from ahead, beyond the next line of trees. I approached cautiously, trying not to make a sound. As I crept closer, the light of a small fire flickered in the distance. I could make out shadows moving around the fire, figures hunched over, busy with something. I couldn't tell what, but I knew I had to get closer. I moved around the clearing, staying behind the thick foliage. And then I saw it, the source of the scream. A person, tied to a tree, struggling against the ropes that bound them. Their eyes were wide with fear, their body covered in cuts. It was clear they had been tortured. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't some simple poaching operation. This was much worse. I barely had time to react before one of the figures turned. My heart skipped a beat. The man's eyes locked onto mine for a split second. He didn't shout, didn't make a sound. He simply raised a hand. I ran. I didn't look back. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly as I sprinted through the dark. My mind was a blur, and my legs burned. I couldn't stop. I had to make it back to camp, had to warn the others. But the more I ran, the more I felt like the shadows were chasing me, that those figures were right behind me, just out of sight. Every rustle in the trees made my pulse spike. I finally stumbled back to camp, exhausted and breathless. I found the others just as confused as I was. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, but all I could do was report what I had seen. We packed up and left as quickly as possible. The operation was compromised, and there was nothing left to do but get out of the woods. I never did find out who those people were or why they were out there. The forest was silent as we left, and for the first time in a long time, I was grateful to hear nothing but the sound of our footsteps and the wind in the trees. But the image of that tortured person stayed with me. The woods, it seemed, had secrets that were better left untouched. I remember the weekend like it was yesterday. It was early October, and the chill in the air hinted at the change of seasons. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. Just me and my best friend, Mark, heading out for a weekend of camping in the woods. We'd done it before, but this time felt different. There was something about this place that unsettled me the moment we arrived. We drove out to a remote area, a good 2 hours from the nearest town, not a soul in sight. We weren't the type of guys to go to a campground with others. We preferred to find a secluded spot, somewhere off the beaten path, where it felt like the world was ours. This place, let's call it Pine Ridge, had a small trailhead where we parked the car and started hiking in. It wasn't a difficult trail, just a simple 2-mile walk, but something about the silence in the air felt too still, too perfect. We set up our tents in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the forest floor. There wasn't a breeze, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots against the dry ground as we unpacked our gear. I remember feeling a twinge of discomfort when I realized how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of a branch above. Mark didn't seem to mind it, though. He was busy with the fire, gathering wood, and cracking jokes about how he was going to cook a 5-star dinner over an open flame. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing around, my eyes scanning the thick trees, half expecting to see movement. But it was always just trees, nothing more. Once the fire was going, I pushed my worries aside. We had beers, snacks, and good conversation. The fire flickered, throwing dancing shadows against the trees. It should have been the perfect evening, but the stillness hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on my chest. Night fell quickly. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, the woods were pitch black, with only the faint outline of trees visible against the sky. Mark and I talked about old camping trips, shared a few more laughs, and eventually settled into our tents for the night. The temperature had dropped, and I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, trying to find comfort. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was a soft thud, almost like a footstep. At first, I thought it was just the forest settling, maybe an animal walking by. But then, there was another sound. It was closer this time. A soft shuffle of leaves, a slow, deliberate step. I lay still, holding my breath. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to call out to Mark. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Another step, closer. I could hear the crunch of the leaves beneath heavy footsteps now. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving with purpose. I pulled the zipper on my tent down just enough to peek outside. The fire had long since died, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon. I couldn't see anything, no shadow, no figure, but the air felt thick, suffocating. Then, without warning, I heard a sharp crack of a twig, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. My heart skipped a beat. The noise was coming from the edge of the clearing, near the trees. Whoever was out there was trying to stay hidden, but they weren't making much of an effort to be quiet. I reached for my phone, but the signal was weak, just a faint bar that flickered on and off. I thought about waking Mark, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. If something was out there, I didn't want to risk alerting it by making noise. I listened for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow and my pulse pounding in my ears. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the noise stopped. The forest around me was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After some time, I gathered enough courage to zip open the tent and step outside. The air was colder now, and the ground had hardened with the drop in temperature. I scanned the clearing with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the underbrush. No sign of anything unusual. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I slowly walked over to Mark's tent and knelt down. I had to wake him. This wasn't normal, and I couldn't stay out there alone anymore. I tapped on the tent lightly, careful not to make too much noise. There was no response. I tapped again, this time louder, but still nothing. I started to panic. Why wasn't he waking up? I reached for the zipper and pulled it open, but Mark's tent was empty. My heart dropped into my stomach. I called out to him, my voice barely a whisper, but there was no answer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the clearing, but Mark was nowhere to be found. I scanned the trees, the shadows between them, but all I could see were the dark outlines of branches swaying in the wind. I thought I was losing my mind, but then I heard it, footsteps, coming from deeper in the woods. Not the dragging sound from earlier, but slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking toward me. My body froze in place. The footsteps were getting closer, and I had no idea what to do. I turned off my flashlight and ducked behind a nearby tree, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then, just ahead of me, I saw something move, a figure, barely visible in the darkness, moving between the trees. I didn't dare make a sound. I stayed as still as possible, watching the figure move slowly, deliberately, toward the spot where Mark's tent had been. The figure was tall, too tall, and its movements were unnatural, almost jerky. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with fear. It stood there for a long time, just beyond the trees, unmoving. I didn't know if it had seen me or not, but I wasn't about to find out. I waited until the figure moved away from the clearing. Then I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning with the effort, my mind racing. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I ran deeper into the woods, stumbling over roots and rocks, not caring if I made noise anymore. I didn't care about anything but putting as much distance between me and whatever that thing was. I kept running, even though I had no idea where I was. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't tell if I was gasping from exhaustion or from fear. After what felt like forever, I tripped and fell. My flashlight flew out of my hand, spinning into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, but I couldn't find it. The forest felt alive with eyes, and I felt like the trees were closing in on me. I heard the footsteps again, closer now, but I couldn't see where they were coming from. Panic surged through me. I ran without thinking, dodging between trees, ignoring the pain in my side. Then, as if by some miracle, I saw a faint light in the distance. It wasn't much, just a small glow through the trees, but it was enough to make me push myself harder. I ran toward it, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled into a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was the faint outline of my car, parked at the edge of the trailhead. Couldn't believe it. I had somehow run in the right direction. I collapsed in front of the car, gasping for breath, my mind still reeling from the terror I had just experienced. The headlights were on, and I could see Mark standing next to the vehicle, looking confused. When I saw him, all the fear and adrenaline drained out of me. I didn't care what had happened anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. Mark didn't remember what had happened either. He said he woke up to find the fire out and the camp completely silent. His tent had been torn, and the gear we left behind was scattered. We couldn't explain it. There was no sign of what I had seen or heard. We left Pine Ridge that night. We didn't look back. Whatever it was in those woods, whatever I had heard and felt, it never made sense, and it's something I will never forget. To this day, I don't know if it was a person, an animal, or something else. But there's one thing I'm sure of, there was something out there, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. The rain had been pouring relentlessly since morning. It wasn't the kind of gentle drizzle you could shrug off, but the kind that soaked everything in minutes. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, planning every detail, and now it felt like a curse. I was 28, and this was supposed to be a solo retreat, a chance to disconnect from everything and everyone. I chose a secluded spot deep in the Smoky Mountains, far from any towns or even other campers. My plan was simple: spend the weekend hiking, reading by the fire, and sleeping under the stars. Of course, it didn't work out that way. The rain wasn't stopping, and by the time I reached my camp, my gear was already soaked. I had chosen a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by dense trees. The forest felt alive, with the sound of rain hitting the leaves and the occasional distant crash of thunder. I set up my tent quickly, trying to make the best of things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I'd been to this part of the mountains before, but that was years ago. Back then, I had been with friends, laughing around a fire, not alone in the wilderness with the storm closing in. Once the tent was up, I threw my gear inside, changed into dry clothes, and settled on the small camp chair I had set up under the awning of the tent. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. There was something eerie about the silence that followed the rain. Everything felt too still, too quiet. I glanced at the creek nearby, its waters swollen and fast-moving, the sound of the rushing water drowned by the constant drumming of rain on my tent. I had brought a small stove to heat up some food, so I lit it and prepared a quick meal of canned soup. I could hear the sound of branches creaking under the weight of the rain, and every now and then, a twig would snap, sending a shiver down my spine. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to make noise in the forest, but the noise tonight felt different, felt off. When I finished eating, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tightly, hoping to stay dry. The storm was showing no signs of stopping, and I could hear the wind picking up, making the trees sway in unnatural ways. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but my mind kept wandering. I kept imagining things moving in the shadows outside my tent. Every little sound, the rustling of leaves, the crack of a branch snapping in the distance, sounded louder, more deliberate, like something was watching me. It wasn't until the sun began to set that the real sense of unease settled in. The daylight quickly faded, and the darkness swallowed the forest whole. With no fire to keep me company, I was left in the blackness of my tent, listening to the rain and wind, feeling more isolated than I ever had before. That was when I heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, like a soft scratching sound, barely audible over the rain. But then it came again, louder this time, a slow dragging sound from outside my tent. I froze, heart racing, unsure of what to do. It was a sound I couldn't place, something dragging across the ground, something heavy. The scratching stopped, and for a few moments there was silence. But the silence was just as unnerving as the sound had been. The rain fell harder, the wind howling through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I lay still, listening for any movement. Then, a different sound broke the stillness. A low grunt, almost like a growl, coming from the direction of the creek. I immediately felt my stomach drop. The only animals that roamed these woods at night were bears, and they didn't usually come this close to human campsites unless they were desperate. But this didn't sound like a bear. It sounded different. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a dragging sound moving closer to my tent. I could feel the weight of the air around me change, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I held mine too, trying to stay as still as possible, hoping whatever it was wouldn't notice me. Then a sudden thud. It was right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, listening. The thud came again, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of something sniffing the ground, its nose brushing against the fabric of the tent. I nearly jumped out of my skin when a sharp scratch came at the side of the tent. Something was clawing at it. It was too large for a raccoon or a fox. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers trembling. The beam flickered to life, and I slowly crawled toward the entrance of the tent. I unzipped it just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. A large shape moved just outside the light's range, something massive and dark, standing on two legs. Its outline was vague in the rain-soaked night, but I could see enough to know it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The figure moved slowly, methodically, dragging something behind it that scraped across the ground. I couldn't make out its features, but it was clearly humanoid. Its body too big, its movements too slow, like it was something that didn't belong in this world. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. It wasn't until the creature stepped closer, bringing its face into the dim light of the flashlight, that I realized what it was dragging. A lifeless body, hanging from its shoulders like a rag doll. The sight of it pushed me over the edge. Panic took over, and I scrambled to zip the tent up, my heart racing faster than I could process. The creature paused, as if sensing my movements inside the tent. I heard another grunt, and then, to my horror, the creature started circling the tent, its claws scraping against the fabric as it walked around. My mind raced. I couldn't stay in the tent, but I couldn't risk going out into the woods either. There was nowhere to go. The forest felt suffocating, as though it had closed in around me. I sat there, trembling in my wet clothes, knowing that if I made a sound, if I moved too suddenly, the creature would hear me. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I finally gathered enough courage to slowly unroll the emergency sleeping bag I had tucked away for emergencies. With slow, careful movements, I packed my backpack with only the essentials: my food, my first aid kit, my flashlight, and a knife. I had no idea if any of it would help, but I had to try something. I waited, praying that the creature would move on, but it never did. It just continued to circle the tent, dragging its horrible burden with it, every now and then stopping to sniff the air. I could feel its presence just outside, hovering like a predator waiting to strike. The sound of the rain intensified, the thunder cracking through the air, masking every slight sound I made. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the creature stopped. The forest fell completely silent. Even the rain seemed to stop for a moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I waited. Nothing happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to peek out again. The flashlight beam flickered weakly as I inched open the tent flap. The creature was gone, but the fear didn't leave. Something told me that it hadn't gone far. It was still watching. I quickly packed up the tent and everything I could carry, deciding that staying in the forest was no longer an option. I stumbled my way through the rain-soaked woods, my mind spinning, unable to trust the shadows, the sound of water, or the very ground beneath my feet. The sky remained thick with clouds, and the storm didn't show any signs of stopping. I didn't look back, not once. When I finally reached the ranger station hours later, soaked to the bone and shaking, I found a group of campers huddled around a fire, unaware of the terror I had just escaped. They greeted me with a mix of curiosity and confusion when I asked if they had seen anything strange in the woods, but I didn't tell them the full story. There was no need. As for me, I've never returned to the Smoky Mountains, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know what I saw that night, but I don't need to. All I know is that there's something in those woods, something that hunts when the rain falls and the sky darkens, something that won't stop until it finds you. And it almost found me.